Okay, cool. So we're talking about the whirlwind of a feature request or need from customers centered around what they're affectionately dubbing forced includes or required pipelines. Um, my opinion on that has not quite changed. I think the discussion I had with Sid was largely a semantics disconnect on my part. Like I don't think I presented the case very well. So what I took away from my conversation with Sid was multifold, and I want to just share with you all a quick diagram I put together, which I think, at least for me, helps visualize what the requirements are. So for these regulated customers, they basically want to ensure that before a change gets to deploy that they've met X, Y, and Z requirements. That manifests as jobs within their pipelines. There's an opportunity for at least some or most of it to pull that out of the pipeline entirely. In this particular case, I spoke with our largest financial customer, and we defined they were very good about articulating very clearly what the process looked like. And so I'm trying to get a follow-up call with them to dig into it in more detail. But basically they treat GitLab projects as applications. And so within their external systems, they refer to GitLab projects as an application. Those applications map to something in a catalog, which is a list of identifiers, as well as an app directory, which my understanding is separate from that catalog of identifiers. And then based on these identifiers, they call out to N number of governance systems. And so those systems check for various things, all kind of like internal and proprietary checks for their compliance and regulatory needs. But for example, if these IDs are lacking, then they want the build to fail. Because it doesn't meet the requirements to then go through the governance checks. There is a separate check called their passport system, which is led by their tech risk team in their IT department. And that is a separate form of requirement or a separate set of requirements for each build. They also have what I would consider standard traceability requirement of here is the business case or the JIRA ticket with the change described for what we're trying to change and push to production. So these are what they call the pre-build checks. And in theory, they should all pass or have their requirements met before a build is completed. These are the things that they have indicated could be pulled out of the pipeline. So I have an issue that exists to allow them to provide an API endpoint. And so in theory, we could send them some sort of payload, data payload that says, here's all this data that you need to process internally. You send us some response back that says, yep, all of these passed. And then if that's the case, the process continues. At the end of the CI pipeline, when they have their deploy artifact, they want to then perform multiple scans. They've described them as a dependency scan, a first party code scan, and then I think there was a third one I'll need to clarify from my notes. But these are kind of like the hard, absolute must requirement before something is deployed to production. And so this is the one that I suspect there's probably a way to pull this out of the pipeline as well, maybe. But the general intent here is that a first iteration should allow customers to say, these jobs should be run for all things of these, or for like all workflows in these regulated projects. That does not mean that we or they should or need to take programmatic action to block a deploy or block a merge request or anything like that. I think for now we can focus on just reporting and say, you told us that A, B, and C requirements had to happen. They did happen. One of them failed, but we'll still allow the workflow to continue. And I think maybe the second iteration is then, okay, now how do we solve for that enforcement piece where we also have that override or escape hatch that allows them to say, even though this process failed, I need to get this to production, and so I'm going to bypass it. So hopefully that's a helpful summary, but I thought that might be a good place to kind of kick off because that's my current understanding and thinking on this.
What's this span that this touches? You said, so this is for a specific customer. I'm interested in understanding like how much of our use cases are this?
How much of you mean like how many customers share that use case?
Yeah.
I have spoken to, I want to say 7 or 8 customers that are, we would consider, that we identify as enterprise, that have shared a similar requirement of, I need to make sure that A, B, or C requirements are met within my CI/CD workflow.
You use the word pre and post build, but nothing that you described in that language had much to do with actually building and building a code into an application. Is that true? Is that just how they mentally framed it as pre and post build, or how are they connected to the actual build process?
So that's how they framed it. And I can go look for the link here in a second when I have a little bit of downtime so that you all have that context as well. But that's how they framed it, to say we have these pre-build checks and we have these post-build checks, which I think maybe highlights that these probably don't have to exist in the pipeline, right? Like maybe we can pull those out in some way, and it's trying to figure out how that manifests.
Yeah, and I think that is the, using the word pre-build makes it sound like it should be in the pipeline process and should be defined in your CI YAML, but that I think is partially what Sid was reacting to, that all those things about pre-build checks, I would describe them as not pre-build checks, as checks that don't require a build. So you could do these checks at any time, and they don't necessarily, you don't have to have built the image yet. The post-build checks all require you to scan something. Right. But those other ones don't. Yeah. And so that, I think, is part of the reaction to those types of things are better left to a merge request approval workflow rather than a define this in your pipeline. And whatever, just because you would be kind of running a similar job to a pipeline, they might translate it into, I want to define this in CI YAML. But if you could do the same thing as an approval workflow for a merge request approval, it would work. One thing that I'm reminded of, has anyone on this call ever had experience with the Garrett review system? It's a similar alternative that's sometimes paired with Jenkins to do code review. And that system has this concept of, in order to merge this, I don't necessarily wait for a pipeline. I wait for these approval checks. And some of those approval checks are programmatic processes. So one of them might be I'm going to lint this. And so I need that lint approval to come through and tell me this thing is that check has passed. But that allows you to mix, I'm going to call this external system, and I need to make sure that there's a JIRA link to it. That has nothing to do with your CI build process. It's more about the approval of don't let this thing through without that check. It might help to separate those two, to not use the build word and instead just say these are checks that need to happen before it can go to production.
Yeah, and I think you framed exactly what they did, which is the issue I referred to about allowing them to plug in an external API endpoint that they control, was what the customer has said is, yeah, that would actually be satisfactory for these checks that are required to happen before a merge request, because they describe them as kind of slow and complicated, and that they can envision an experience where, yes, send us the data we need, and then we can crunch that outside of GitLab, outside of the pipeline. And then as long as it's fed back into GitLab as part of that merge request widget, so that they're informed and have that data all in one place for an artifact they can export at some point, then I think that satisfies those initial checks. Then it's the, I guess, pre-deployment or right before deployment that we then need to focus on.
Yeah, and so just my understanding of that video, and I've been through Jeremy knows this too, through the forced includes discussion, is that the concern of using a tool like forced includes to say, hey, all projects have to have these included pipelines, is that you are obfuscating what that is and have the potential to block production way too easily. And so I'd rather, if you take the instances where you're actually not needing to touch the code at all and move that to a merge request approval, then those are the kinds of things that you can say, oh, and I'm bypassing this required approval, I'm still going to merge it. Or yeah, even if I don't understand it, I know that there's a merge request approval happening, and that approval is out of band from anything that I can go look at the logs at in my pipeline logs.
Yeah, I think that's aligned with my thinking is that we already have this existing paradigm that, oh, there's a merge request approval process. You're already going to get held up to meet some requirement. And so why not incorporate these external systems, but just in a way that fits the current precedent or paradigm for it? And as I thought about my conversation with Sid more, I think, somebody please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the misunderstanding was that we're not wanting to mess with the CI process, right? Like we want developers to have a great experience. It's the CD process that customers are ultimately seem to be concerned with, which is before this actually makes it to production, before it's deployed, I want to make sure that, okay, this merge request has those preliminary checks done, but then also right before deploy, once I have that build artifact, I want to make sure that I have these scans done and all these other checks that are required right before I deploy. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think you could, actually the way you described that, there is probably one other solution, which is your post-merge pipeline that is doing some sort of deploy action might have a manual step there that just says, hey, before going further. I mean, you could have one, you could do this today probably. Like you could have one step in that post-merge pipeline that says collect all the important information and runs a script that goes and calls APIs, and then the next one that says, you know, take an action as a result of those APIs. I think the difficulty, the reaction is less about where that's happening and more about forcing the inclusion of those to where the user cannot experience them or override them. So,
yeah, I agree with that. And I think what I would like.
Do you really agree with that? Because what Kenny just said is that a user is empowered to override their pipeline. And in these cases where I've talked to other regulated customers, their desire is for users to not override their YAML file and to do a deploy to production.
I agree with it because ultimately the paradigm exists already within regulated environments and compliance frameworks that, like, yes, we have these processes, we have these things, these requirements that have to be met, but we also have escape hatches. Those escape hatches are intended to be kind of like the emergency, oh shit moment. They're not intended to be used regularly. And I think that's the nuance we'd have to hone in on, is if we implement this type of feature, how do we then empower customers to make sure that this is not happening like with every single deploy? Because every single deploy is not an emergency. So there is a balancing act there, but in terms of solving the original misunderstanding or miscommunication internally between myself and Sid, I do agree with that approach because, one, I think the merge request widget is sort of like the single source of truth for releases or deploys, right? Like changes. And so the idea of like, hey, we approve this to then merge it, and then post merge, we're going to come back to that single source of truth and see, oh, there's also these additional things that had to occur. Did those in fact occur? I think creates a productive cycle that the audit and compliance folks would be happy to have. But there is that nuance there that I would want to make sure we address.
Yeah, and I don't speak the language of compliance, but in previous lives, we've called those compensating controls. And so if what we're talking about is enabling the documentation of a compensating control for a customer so that they can say, yes, developers can override, but we showcase every time that they do or create some report for every time that they do, that might solve the compliance need of this customer, of this class of customers.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. Like, and I'm curious, Matt, have you received any customer feedback on whether or not that's kind of an acceptable approach? Because for me, like the revelatory moment in that Sid conversation was, I think it feels like twofold, which was the first was around, always allowing an escape hatch for human beings, because when we talked about enforcement before, we always thought about this as a very strict control. But then Sid's approach of like, well, production's down, like we don't have the opportunity to wait for someone else to get off, who's out of office, so we need like to do this deploy right now. I think is definitely worthwhile. And I think that just like So that, what does that mean? That neither means that we have the ability to override like that quote unquote required approval with like the help of another human being, or we write some evidence artifact like when the deploy happens and we do the override to say like, hey, we're gonna write this note, or we'll create this issue, and like to have evidence that this thing happened for someone else after the fact to go ahead and check and say like whether or not this is acceptable. So that's kind of one thing. And the other thing was maybe, is the aha moment for me was, I agree with something you said earlier, which is this is a little bit dependent on the type of environment that you're deploying into, whereas all these controls need to be more strictly followed for a protected environment like production. But maybe we don't care as much about these artifacts in place for something like staging, where we just want to go ahead and get something into the environment. We don't really care as much about following these exact controls. But when it comes to actually deploying to production, then absolutely want to make sure that these things are checked. So I guess those are the two things that I took away from the conversation. Have you had a chance to talk to any customers and get their take on whether or not this is kind of like an acceptable direction?
Yeah, about that specific concern, I don't have conversations. The initial conversations that I've had have touched on it. So to address your first point about should we generate the evidence artifact, have two-person control, I think the answer is both. It follows the same logic of that issue that's open for two-person approvals for sensitive project setting changes, I think it is. But that applies to this, right? You shouldn't have a single person who's capable of overriding something by themselves at their sole discretion. It should involve that second person who says, oh, yes, this is reasonable, this is needed or necessary, we should make this change. And it should maybe auto-create an issue for that project with some format that says merge request number 1 was overridden, and the description has some data about the merge request, and maybe we prompt the user for a description at the time so that they can justify why they're overriding it. For the second question about, help me remember, you touched on, the different environments. I think it depends, right? Like some customers may say and have communicated that, yeah, we only care about production. In my personal experience and from maybe one or two of the conversations, there was mention of the requirement to also manage changes to the staging or testing environments, because my opinion on that, because I didn't dig into it with them specifically, it was just kind of a casual mention, but my understanding of that would be, yes, we ultimately care about what changes make it into production, but that starts with changes that are made into the testing or staging environment. And like, what if something changes from where it was in staging to how it ended up in production, those sorts of things. But I don't have specific or explicit feedback about that, which is what I would like to collect after this type of conversation, where we have a much better idea, I think, of the direction we want to head for this.
I think this is an interesting thought, because I'm undergoing this environments validation right now, and I'm learning that customers have different expectations based off of how they've defined an environment. So for example, staging for one customer may actually be where they compile a quarterly build that they then push to production. So therefore, staging is a production stage rather than like a dev environment where we're able to test things in a CD world. So if they're not using CD, this becomes very different than if someone's using CD and they're constantly deploying to a target environment from master. But if master isn't gold, or if they don't have a branch that they're working from that they promote, that they use a whole environment to do that, then this becomes a very different use case.
Yeah, it's kind of like, depends on if staging is a stop on your way to production or is like a validation cycle itself.
Right.
Matt, one thing that I want to make sure, and this is, I only am aware of this context because of my history here. Sid mentioned, in that video, the importance of this similar paradigm in how we approached our security tools. And I just want to make sure that, stop me if this is already, you're aware of it, but I want to make sure you're aware of what that meant for our approach to our security tools and how that impacted how we did it. And there might be some tools that are useful in this same kind of compliance regime. We had said, most security tools, people install them but don't use them because they are set up to block production deploys and people just say, there's too much here, I can't do anything, I'm turning the damn thing off. And so we intentionally from the start said, our security tools will never block deploys to production. We'll give you the report. What you choose to do with that report is up to you. And since then, we've evolved for some of these compliance regimes to have things like dismissing vulnerabilities, where when you dismiss a vulnerability, it does create an artifact that then gets created. Or you can dismiss a vulnerability and create an issue as a result. Or you're required to dismiss vulnerabilities. Or there's required merge request approvals if there are vulnerabilities found, that if we found any, you've got to have some other person come and look at that merge request. Those are all compliance standards compliance or enforcement standards that we've built that weren't, that avoided us having that check block production automatically. Those similar patterns might be useful here, to just think of a similar compliance check that then creates this list of compliance vulnerabilities or like non-compliance report, and then the developers can choose to create issues, dismiss them. If they dismiss them, it creates an artifact. If it requires a merge request approval as a result, that happens. So that might be a useful pattern.
Yeah, no, I am definitely aware of those patterns and precedents. The interesting thing for me is that it is admittedly a bit of a struggle coming from a compliance role and that industry and mindset, and having an appreciation for the customers who say like, no, I need it to be exactly this way. And that's at odds with what we would like to do, which is allow developers to just very smoothly operate and have no hindrance whatsoever. Like those are literally mutually exclusive things of what the compliance world needs and what developers want for a good experience.
Are they? So there was another point that I actually would have said was the interesting takeaway from that video. How did Sid phrase it? He said something like, what you might need to do is not talk to the customers, but talk to their auditors, which would be like, put yourself in the shoes of, I'm looking for my customer's best interest. They might be telling me I want to block all production, but I know that that's not going to lead them to success. So if I talk directly to an auditor and say, what if we allowed this more smooth operation for the developers, but we had these compensating controls? Your customer would never come to you and say that because they haven't thought through that. But
well,
if
I don't
you
think
put yourself in the position of trying to convince their auditors.
Sure. No, I mean, that's a valid point, and I don't disagree with it. I think the challenge there is going to be that it's not so much that the customers haven't thought about it, it's that they're managing risk and liability, which has like the financial impact and consequence, right? And like, it's all about managing that risk or that impact. But like the auditors, we can talk to them and we will. What I suspect will happen is that we'll get a wide range of responses because every auditor is going to be different. Some auditor is going to do it by the book, dot every I, cross every T, and say, yeah, you can have compensating controls, but ideally I want to see as very few of those as possible. Other auditors will be like, yeah, if you got compensating controls and I can follow that breadcrumb trail, that's great. So I agree. Like it's not necessary. So I guess they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's certainly a spectrum we'll be dealing with as far as the tolerances from either the auditors or the customers. And that's why I'm okay taking like a passive approach initially to kind of temper my own expectations and try to align better with kind of GitLab's core values around this particular context. And as we learn from what's actually needed beyond that, we can then iterate and work towards that. And we may find that that's perfectly acceptable.
It's interesting you said that these companies are managing risk. Sorry, Kenny. Whenever we slow down development, we're telling their developers they're not able to deliver value to their customers, which might have an impact on their revenue and development. And ultimately their risk is we're going to slow down development, potentially not deliver features for our customers. So it could have the same negative implications of getting an audit and need to pay a fine because they're not able to deliver features fast. So something to think about there.
Matt, you said something that made me wonder, do we dog food this today? Like we ourselves purport to some compliance regimes. I wonder if we could, because that would be a response to an auditor saying, oh, this is not enough, to be like, well, no, we passed it. I know you can't just say I passed it with this other auditor, so that means it's okay. But you could say like, this passes for us. And I know we're talking about different compliance regimes, but I wonder if they're.
Yeah, I have a recurring meeting with Jeff Burrows on the security compliance team internally. He is my internal customer, so we talk about a lot of this. He's supportive of basically all of this that I propose. I haven't yet talked to him about this particular pivot, and I'm not entirely sure if it's the same, since we're kind of operating within GitLab, using GitLab. So I'd have to do some digging there in this new context. But it's a good point that I can follow up on.
Yeah, and that's not, I was just wondering if we're providing reports to auditors today based on how we ship software,
yeah,
we might have had some workarounds that our customers would find useful.
Yeah, I can certainly follow up with them on that specific ask for sure. And Jackie, a quick response to you. I know we're at time. I agree with you. And I think at that point, it comes down to, do we manage the short-term risk or the long-term risk? And I don't know the answer there. I don't even know if, I assume our customers are managing that and calculating that risk, but you have an absolutely valid point.
It might be interesting to do like an A/B test on this, to create like a scenario and validate with customers on if they feel like they're managing risk better by blocking production or by providing a really strong audit trail of these events. And it might be better for us to provide the audit trail and the value in ROI that people are able to ship super fast, and then compare it to a scenario where people were being blocked by things like compliance and security scans. Because this again would be getting at the point of, would blocking production really mitigate risk? Or are they going to end up overriding it because they can't figure out what they're actually violating and pushing it to production anyways?
Yeah, and I suspect that'll be a broad spectrum, because this particular customer we've referred to has said, I would rather block everything going to production than risk something getting into production that is non-compliant.
And are they doing that today? Are they blocking things in production today?
I'd have to go reread through it, but I believe so. I'm not entirely sure though.
I know we're over time. The discussion was originally about this one issue about continued support of forced includes. I'll just say personally, I am on the side of us not adding new functionality to forced includes. I know it's out there and we've said it's deprecated. Is that where we're all at, or is that still an open question?
No, I agree with that. My original point was like, well, if we add these override mechanisms and make it passive, does that satisfy the requirements? But I agree, we should not undeprecate or continue to evolve it. We should just work on what this new solution looks like.
Okay, cool. So Jackie, will you make that comment on the issue and close it?
I actually have one going right now, so we're good to go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for going a little bit over. I appreciate your time and your brain power on this.
Yeah, Matt, and let us, I don't know if you got what you were looking for from this discussion. So I understand there's a very tricky situation where you're put in between customers who are essential to the revenue and ongoing livelihood of this business and some product principles. And I appreciate your skill in navigating them. So thank you. But if you didn't feel like you got what you needed, we can schedule another conversation.
One parting question that I might have for everyone to think about is, like, I'm not sure where the in terms of the responsibilities of like developing this functionality, where they lie, whether it's manage compliance versus like verify. And so what I would suggest we do is that maybe we validate kind of the direction that we're going, do some solution validation with some of these customers to make sure that this is the right direction. And then we can kind of collaborate on which groups make sense to do kind of what in terms of iterating on that vision, towards that vision. But I think that might be still an open question, because I don't know if compliance has all of the, the expertise needed to be able to iterate on this solo.
Yeah, can we say that Matt's the drive for it, and if it comes down to, hey, as a global priority, we need other teams to help work on this, we can have it in like that frame of mind, Jeremy? Because I don't want it to be left ambiguous about who's driving it forward. Because I think
yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, but yes, Kenny, I did get a lot of valuable information out of this, so thank you.